Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in for today's webinar. We're going to give folks just a couple of more minutes to join, and then we're going to get started. All right, we are 4 minutes past the hour. We are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strengthening your insider risk program based on 2022 trends, especially. So, from countless stories of mass breaches, starting from employee negligence all the way to unfortunate situations where employees are stealing and selling trade secrets, insider risks can continue to pose a major threat to businesses, of course. And so as we progress deeper into 2022, we thought this was a great time to look at what's new on the horizon and how companies can adapt. And so we'll dig into this more, but first, a quick intro on who I am. Just so you know who you're hearing from, I'm Dr. Christine Swafor. I'm the founder and CEO of Cyber Pop-Up. Some background on me: I've worked in the cybersecurity industry for over a decade. I've led everything from training and awareness programs that focus heavily on insider threat to data loss prevention and how to stop your intellectual property and important information from leaking outside of the company, and much more. And so super excited to dig into this topic today. Now, as I was mentioning, over the last few years, there's been quite a bit of evolution happening around just the topic of insider threats and how organizations have to view external threats coming in and posing as insiders, all the way to, again, your own internal employees who can introduce risk to the company. And so to bring you up to speed on this topic in today's day and age, during this session, we will cover recent cybersecurity trends between last year and this year that are really informing the way that we have to adapt to some of these risks. We'll talk about the evolution of insider threat and that transition into insider risk and some of the impacts that has to businesses. Then I'll get into some real world breach examples across various industries, including healthcare, manufacturing, telecom, and food and retail. And then we'll get into some of the deeper challenges of managing some of these risks. And then finally, tips for strengthening your insider risk program given this evolving climate. You'll also get a chance to see how you can leverage real technology to reduce these risks in real time. So we'll have Suzanne from the Veriato team come on and share a little bit more about that as well. So stay tuned for that. Now, jumping right in here, I wanted to start out by talking about one of the shifts that has created some level of buzz over the last couple of, I would say, weeks, months, and maybe even year. And that's this difference or differentiation between insider risk and insider threat. Now, even though insider risks and insider threats deal with the same problem, insider risks are looking at things from a more holistic standpoint and really looking at organizational, I would say, risk tolerance when it comes to insiders. While threat is really limited to, the active nature of insiders kind of, going rogue, presenting challenges in the company, and some prevention strategies specifically to addressing that. And so the main differentiator here is that the insider risk area is just a much more robust and I think business focused way of looking at this topic, which is a great evolution and a great transition to make for any organization. I think with the latest trends and the way that things are going, you have to look at risk from a more holistic standpoint, of course. And so a little shift there. And the one thing that I do want to call out also on this is that, in any organization, right, insiders prevent risks, but it's the malicious intent of an individual that defines a threat, right, or that makes it a threat. And so these risks often stem from the advantage that an internal attacker has over an external threat, right? An external threat has to come in and learn a ton or try to figure things out. It might take a little bit longer versus an internal threat, and the risk that provides is a lot higher or unique in a sense that these folks tend to have that authorized access already. They tend to know some of these systems in and out, and so the level of risk that they are introducing to organizations can be a little bit more elevated. And so in this shift, again, in managing all of that, insider risk management really builds a framework around this new paradigm of risk tolerance and aiming to give security teams the visibility and the context around, data activity, and around user activity and around all of these elements that you need in order to protect data without putting too many constraints on the actual user or diminishing their experience. And so we're in a position now where it's like, instead of only managing or focusing on the user, right? It's like you're opening your scope up to focus more on every asset that insiders touch, be it infrastructure, be it devices, and so on. And so again, that broadened scope. Now we'll dig into kind of how this will shift the way that companies approach insider risk management in a second. But I first wanted to just walk through a couple of the latest trends and stats that we're seeing across the insider risk industry, to help just set some more context on the landscape here. So I'll quickly go through a couple of them. The first one is that 60% of data breaches stem from insiders. So 6 in 10 breaches recently came from insiders. The numbers of these types of incidents grew by almost 50% over a span of 2 years. And so, I mean, it's no secret that, cyber attacks and breaches and everything in between, like it just continues to grow. But the specifics in the source and the way that these attacks are happening, we're seeing some growth on the insider side as well. And so, of course, while all businesses are concerned with attacks that are coming from the outside, this insider space continues to be an area of concern for many. Another one is that every year, more than 34% of businesses worldwide are affected by insider threats. This came from CISA InfoSec. And so just a good reminder that a good number of businesses are struggling with managing this type of threat. And so for those that are, on the webinar today, you're not alone. I hear this feedback from pretty much every company. Another interesting stat is that insider attacks, of course, take a longer time to resolve, and that results in higher costs than, of course, attacks that typically takes less time. So digging into that more, it's like when you think about the fact that an internal attacker is in the system longer, they're usually able to avoid certain detection triggers much more effectively than someone who is outside of the organization. That adds to the cost because, generally speaking, it's like that's a known thing. The longer it takes to detect an attack, the longer someone is doing malicious things in your network, the more expensive the attack is. And so by default, insider attacks tend to be more expensive, and we continue to see that grow. Another report that I was reading, I saw and found interesting, it takes 90 days longer to resolve an insider threat than it does an external. So that's, uh, 3 months essentially of extra time that you're losing in resolving this type of attack. Another interesting one that I found is that 85% of organizations find it difficult to determine the actual damage of the attack. So, kind of piggybacking off of the last statistic there, in that it takes a long time to resolve these because it takes a long time to actually figure out what happened, especially when someone has the insight to try and cover their tracks and try to do some more advanced just covering up and hiding from detection. And so that said, most organizations even struggle with trying to figure out what happened in order to even respond or in order to recover from that attack as well. And so having programs and having processes in place early on that can help set you up for success in being able to figure out that damage become important as well. And we'll dig into that more in a bit. Another one, 67% of accidental insider threats still come from phishing attacks. So phishing has been around forever. At this point, I feel like I've talked about it so much, and it's not going away because it still remains an effective means of attackers taking advantage of users and getting into systems and getting unauthorized access. And so in this case, it's like with the growth of everything from advanced phishing attacks to leveraging AI and machine learning and deep fakes and things like that to make some of these attacks seem way more convincing and way more realistic. All the way to the popular use of leveraging phishing attacks as a way to get ransomware into organizations. I mean, there's just so much, it's so versatile how you can leverage these attacks. And so attackers continue to hone in on and take advantage of that as well. And then, last couple here, one, the percentage of insider incidents that were caused by trusted business partners is up to 25% at this point. And I think that's just a huge reminder, right, that the risk of third parties and paying attention to insiders and folks who have authorized access beyond your traditional employees and beyond your traditional quote unquote what people would consider to be your internal resources. We can't neglect those third parties and those trusted partners that we're allowing access into our systems, whether it's through logins or through APIs, through system connections, everything in between. And then actually another stat that I found interesting that kind of relates to this is the sectors and how some of these things slice up there. So for example, the sectors that see the highest insider attacks tend to be places like finance and insurance. Other ones that are also high on the list, healthcare, the federal government, entertainment, all of those experience high levels of insider attacks that stem from third parties. And that's because when you think about the nature of some of these spaces, right, it's like the insurance industry relies very heavily on, brokers and all kinds of parties to further their businesses. And so huge third party involvement there. Same with, government, same with healthcare. And so a lot of these places that tend to deal with large volumes of contractors and things like that tend to be higher up on this list as well. And then the last stat that I want to touch on is one that is more geared around, what are the types of attacks that are happening? And this can give some insight into some of the motives behind it, right? So 55% of these attacks were fraud. Almost 50% were monetary gains, 44% were IP theft, which, if you double click into IP theft, for example, oftentimes that still leads to monetary gain for a lot of people who are intentionally being malicious, right? And taking that information to either sell it to competitors, taking that information to start their own companies. There's been tons of examples where employees have taken intellectual property from their employer and tried to use that to start a competitive brand. And so this just gives some insight into some of the motivations, some of the reasons why people are launching some of these attacks. And then if you look at knowing that these are the motives, it's like what departments tend to be most involved in these. According to reports, it's everything from the finance departments tend to be huge. So in one survey, 41% of insider threat attacks and breaches stemmed from or had some involvement of the finance department. So, that might be an area where you want to pay, super close attention to, though, again, these threats can come from anywhere in the organization. If anyone has authorized access to a system. Another department is the technology department. Of course, technology folks tend to have more privileged access, especially when they're maintaining systems and resources. And so that's another department or area of concern. Research and development is another one. So the folks who are working on the true kind of secret sauce of the company, research and development departments tend to have the greatest access to those trade secrets, that intellectual property. And so that's another group that is high on the list. Again, calling out these examples just to give some flavor and context to how this plays out in organizations, but by no means is it limited to those groups. An insider threat, again, can stem from any department, anyone who has authorized access to your systems and your data. So I'm going to shift gears now and just talk a little bit more about who these insiders are. Of course, the specific roles and all of those things, of course, vary across industries, but at the end of the day, I want to be clear on the fact that it's really anyone who has access to technology or data, anyone who has access to those systems, anyone who has access to facilities in one way or another can pose a threat. I hear some people, have the misconception that it's like, oh, well, if somebody is I don't know, let's say just doing more physical work, or somebody is, working in a store or whatever the case may be, how could they possibly pose a threat? But there are so many different examples, and I'll walk through some examples in a bit, but there are so many different examples of folks who you wouldn't think could introduce that risk, but because they do have access to use something as simple as email and can click on something they shouldn't, or because someone has approached them and convinced them to click on something they shouldn't, or convince them to course and work with the technology team to do something. There's all kinds of ways that this can play out, to where I just want to emphasize that the scope of who falls into the realm of insider threat and who can contribute to that growing insider risk, the scope is very broadened at this point, especially as workforces continue to expand geographically and so on. So just a growing trend there. Now, getting into some of the examples that I mentioned, and I want to pause real quick. I failed to mention this at the beginning. If you all have questions, I see folks on. If you all have questions as I'm walking through any of the information, please don't hesitate to drop that in the chat, and I'd be happy to keep an eye on those and answer them as things come up. Now, getting into some of the real world examples of these breaches and some of these attacks, the first one that I want to touch on is this example in healthcare. So um, in this case, the medical packaging company was undisclosed, but this happened very recently. This was a case of employee sabotage, essentially. So last year, federal prosecutors convicted a former employee of a medical device company because they basically launched this sabotage campaign that delayed shipment of personal protective equipment, so masks, things like that, in the height of the pandemic and in the height of the initial kind of response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so basically what happened is that after this person was terminated from the company, they accessed the company's shipping system. They used the fake account that they had created previously with their administrative privileges, and they used that account to disrupt and delay these shipments. They then made a second account and used that to edit and delete more than 100,000 company records, which caused further delays for them. And so this is a prime example of insider of an insider going rogue and creating that level of risk to the business, right? Both from an operation standpoint, from a reputation standpoint, from a financial standpoint, and then even from a health and well-being standpoint, right? In the middle of something as crucial as a global pandemic, this insider was able to have this level of impact on this company. Another example is the something that happened with Toyota. So this is more on the manufacturing side. This was a business email compromise attack that landed in about $37 million in fraud. The attack happened quite a while ago, but wasn't disclosed until a little bit more recently. But in this case, a scammer managed to trick a member of a finance team at a European subsidiary of Toyota to wire this almost $40 million to a foreign account. They were able to craft an attack that was convincing enough to warrant this amount of transfer, right? $40 million is not chump change. It's not a small purchase by any means. And so they had to really do some deep reconnaissance and observe communication patterns between internal employees and partners in order to mimic that trusted entity and in order to launch an attack that was convincing enough to warrant this kind of transfer. So another example also, is just a reminder of what I mentioned before around finance teams being targeted the most. This is a prime example of that. Another one that was interesting. It involved AT&T. This was a bribery-fueled malware installation that cost $200 million in fraud, essentially. So in this case, the AT&T company was subject to a very lengthy criminal operation where these attackers were, or this insider essentially, I still, even though somebody's an insider, call them an attacker if you have malicious intent, because to me that's what it is. But it was this operation to unlock the iPhones for use outside of the AT&T network. And so this involved bribing company employees who had access to the company systems in order to do that. And so these external attackers were able to convince internal employees to join in on this sort of fraud scheme. And, they also had processes for paying call center employees at AT&T to install malware on the systems there to gain greater access to some of these devices, and so just a web of bribery and all kinds of things that led to this scheme costing the company $200 million in lost subscriptions across 2 million phones that were unlocked. Eventually, someone was arrested for this crime and sentenced to 12 years in prison. And again, it's this person was, reportedly brought to justice. But when you think of the loss that comes with this insider's actions, right, and the hit to the brand reputation, the hit to the finances and to the operations of the company, it's just much greater. Okay, so last couple of examples here. One, a data leak in the finance sector. So in this case, with Capital One, 100 million credit card applications and accounts were compromised. What happened in this case is that a former software engineer from Amazon, AWS, was able to abuse their knowledge and the insight that they had gained through their employment about different deployment weaknesses. And they were able to use that insight in order to cause this breach at Capital One. And so, soon after that, several charges were filed against this perpetrator, who again was internal to Amazon and was able to exploit these misconfigured cloud services to pull that information of 100 million credit card applicants. So it's just another example of this. This ties into the third party piece, right? It's like the insider in this case was actually someone who was, from a completely different company, who just understood the ins and outs and the vulnerabilities and the technology that they're providing to this customer, and now this customer has been compromised as a result of that. So prime example of the severity of potential third-party risk, and why, from an insider standpoint, it's something that needs to be paid close attention to as well. Okay, so next one here, still on the financial institution route, but this is one of sabotage that I wanted to touch on because we haven't really dug into kind of account privileges and access there. But in this case, this was deprovisioning gone bad. So a former employee of a New York credit union was able to log into the systems a couple of days after being fired. That happened because, of course, like, her accounts weren't completely disabled when she left, and that's like one of the prime rules, right? It's like if an employee is terminated, for the most part, there should be policies around getting that access removed immediately. Otherwise, the risk of an insider doing damage, or the risk of that insider threat, is just much higher in that window, and so you want to act very quickly there. In sort of almost 1 hour rampage, this disgruntled former employee deleted 20,000 files and almost 4,000 directories from this company. This included, mortgage applications and all kinds of things. She also accessed sensitive documents, including board minutes and things that she, shouldn't have been, downloading or deleting or accessing altogether. And so, huge reminder there on, again, not insiders are not just people who are currently employed, but when you don't have strong deprovisioning processes from an access standpoint, you have to think about all of your former employees as insider threats as well, which is an even scarier place to be in, because former employees, especially if terminated, there's it's not saying that, of course, everybody's going to come back with malicious intent, but when people are disgruntled, the risks of those actions are much higher. Last example that I'll do here, I know this is a lot, but I think it paints a very diverse picture of the different ways that insider risks and threats continue to show up. This is an example with Garrett popcorn shops, for any Chicago folks on the line. I love Garrett's popcorn. It is highly addictive. But in this case, there was an employee who was a former director of research and development. And so, again, ties into the very example the note that I mentioned before around research and development folks really being an area of focus, or a huge area of risk when it comes to insider threats. So this director of research and development stole more than 5,000 files from the company, including ingredients of the products that Garrett's popcorn sells, recipes, formulas, methods for cooking or making these products. They took all of those files onto a drive, a personal drive, and we're also sending these files to their personal email address. And so that is an example where, people, when you think about food and retail, it's like any company, there are trade secrets, there is information that you don't want to get into the wrong hands. And so it just goes to show that across every industry, these are things that we have to continue to pay attention to. That's the last example there. I just wanted to paint a good picture of the fact that a lot of these things are not, this is not theory, right? This is very real, and they're things that we have to continually pay attention to and continually adapt to, especially as the risks in each of these areas heighten. Because the other thing that I'll mention quickly is like some of the examples that I walked through today, right? It's like some of them happened within the last year, some happened within the last couple of years. Well, what we see is these underlying trends continue to compound and continue to expand. And so I feel like we can just continue to expect these types of attacks and how the sources and how they're happening. We can just continue to expect that to grow. Now, getting into the challenges that companies face when reducing insider risk, I've touched on a lot of these through the examples and things, but just want to bring it all together so we're all on the same page and can understand these a little bit better. So just given the last couple of years and the rise of a lot of people racing to go digital and racing to take their operations online when they might not have had the time to thoughtfully prepare for it, that has added to the rapid evolution of the threat landscape. That coupled with with more people working remotely and working in hybrid environments, the user landscape has expanded as well. When you have folks who are now working in a household with several different people sharing devices, all kinds of things going on, the threats landscape just continues to evolve, and that's not going to go away anytime soon, especially as we see more companies embrace hybrid setups. Network complexity and the lack of visibility is another one. So as users and as devices continue to get distributed in this way, it just adds to the complexity, and it makes that visibility for your tech team or for your security team, whoever's trying to manage and secure all of this. It makes it a lot more difficult if you can't get the right visibility into your users and into the devices that are being used. Another one is the advanced attack modes that we continue to see. So ransomware is a big example, right? It's like one of the most common ways that ransomware gets into a company is through a user introducing it, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally. And so we continue to see that grow. That poses a challenge in how companies are managing insider risk. I touched on this already as well, but the phishing and social engineering attacks continue to pose a greater challenge because attackers are doing deeper reconnaissance, and because with the growth of data and how much data is publicly available and how much people are willing to share, that is another area where there's just so much more information out there for attackers to do that reconnaissance on, and to build more impactful or more convincing attacks. So that's another area. Insider knowledge and control circumvention. So also mentioned this before, insiders have that deeper insight into what's going on in the company, and that just always poses a challenge because they're a lot harder to detect, and they're a lot better at evading some of the controls that you would have in place either way. And so tons of things there. I think one other piece that I want to touch on is also the impact of things like the use of social media. This goes back to how much data is just available out there already today, but when you look at how people are leveraging, social media and things like that, and how comfortable they are with sharing more information through these channels, um, again, the ability to impersonate people, the ability to mimic people's, character and things like that, it just continues to pose a greater challenge in this space. So yeah, those are a couple of the challenges that I wanted to talk through. But now, shifting gears to what can we do about this, right? All hope is not lost. There are ways that we can continue to adapt as organizations and as an industry to make sure that we are addressing these growing trends and these growing threats. So these are a couple of tips for updating your insider risk management program for the modern age. So the very first thing that I want to touch on is updating your program to incorporate user behavior analytics if you aren't already. I still believe that keeping users and their activity at the core of an insider risk management program goes a long way, because at that point you're not just relying on some of the more traditional measures. You're really able to look into what a user is, not only what a user is supposed to be doing or what their normal behavior is, but then also looking at all of the context around that and some of the deeper insight that you can get into a user's again, behavior, a user's role, the things that they should and shouldn't be doing. Having that more holistic picture make a huge difference in this space. The next step on managing third-party risk systemically, can't stress that enough. A lot of the examples that I shared today involve some form or fashion of third-party enablement, right? And so it's like when you're building your insider risk management program and you're looking at that user behavior analytics, make sure that you're able to do that from a third-party standpoint as well. So that, as you have these folks and trusted partners connected to your business, you're able to see when their behavior is off as well. Building a dedicated ransomware management strategy is also critical, in my opinion. So oftentimes people default to just doing general sort of incident response planning, and tend to try to bucket ransomware response and ransomware management into that category. But what we're starting to see is that that's not enough. Like, yes, it's critical to have an insider or an incident response program. It's definitely critical, but having a ransomware specific subset or having a ransomware specific strategy altogether that's separate can go a long way, because there's just so many nuances and so many different layers to preparing for and protecting against ransomware that I think traditional incident response frameworks might not cover fully. And then the last couple of things, alluded to this earlier as well, leveraging next generation threat detection and response tools. So moving away or moving beyond traditional sort of anomaly based threat detection to stuff that is more context rich and has more of that holistic approach to threat detection is important. Training and awareness, of course. A lot of insider risk stems from users doing things that they shouldn't be doing, again, whether it's intentional or unintentional. If you can train people on the ins and outs of cybersecurity and the ins and outs of what they should be doing and the consequences if they introduce some of these risks to the company, I think that also just heightens that awareness and helps reduce some of the risk as well. And then lastly, paying attention to access management and adopting a zero trust culture. So, going back to the example I mentioned before on everything from the deprovisioning issue, right, where if former employees are able to come in and do things that they shouldn't, to folks before they leave creating accounts, fake accounts that they then access later, right? We saw an example of that. And so there's all of this risk around access management that's tied to insider risk. And I think that it's important now more than ever, this has been a topic over the last, couple of years now, but adopting that zero trust culture where you never trust, always verify, and really integrating that into all of your security strategies, I think helps as well. Now, I know I've shared quite a bit here. We've gone through some of the trends and statistics. We've dug into kind of who modern day insiders are today. We've talked about some real breach examples and some challenges that are making this space tough for companies to adapt, as well as some very I would say achievable recommendations on what you can do to update your insider risk management program. So hopefully that sheds some light into some ways to adapt in today's world. What we want to do now is, of course, show what that can look like in reality. You know, it's always good to hear. You know, this context and some of the research and things like that, but to actually see how you can begin to manage some of these risks goes a long way. And so for that, I am going to hand over control to Suzanne from the Very Auto team, who is going to walk you through what this looks like in practice. So
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. I'm going to share my screen as soon as I have control.
okay. Okay, I just stopped sharing.
Thank you. There you go. Perfect. Thank you very much. This has been quite enlightening, Christine. There's so much that you've covered in this segment, and I took down a few notes because some of the things that you mentioned, you know, these things that we've been talking about for years, but the first thing you're going to do now is go and do some research. What are you going to look for? All the recommendations that Christine made, you need to start looking at those solutions. The three things that I really picked up is, you know, loss is big, the loss of money, loss of branding because of some of these attacks or some of these insider capabilities that have occurred. And of course, all the way to potentially losing the company if all your customer information is being exfiltrated out. So the first kinds of things you want to do is to be preemptive, to be proactive, to start protecting everything that you're going to do. And I want to kind of address the two solutions that we have. One of them that addresses, you know, you talked about ransomware and having a program to address that. So we have a solution from a technology point of view that can address the ransom safe approach. You may tell me that you already have an antivirus solution, but that's not enough to stop ransomware. Ransomware is more of a malware environment where your antivirus will stop something that isn't a particular known variant. In the ransomware world, there are some specific indicators of what a kit is or what a ransomware looks like. So you really need to be aware of what they are and how to prevent those from communicating it through different drives and different systems. The ability to have your data accessible after, even if the ransomware does get into your system, your backups are not going to be enough. You need to find a way to get your data as fast as possible back to the current state. So what our solution does, it does really very quickly, it does 4 things, and then the last thing is your recovery part. But the first thing is like it installs in 10 minutes. It will detect and alert you when a ransomware is infiltrated. When a ransomware has a known variant, so we have the ability to know when a variant, or just like the COVID-19 variants, there are a multitude of them. In the world of ransomware, there are variants of variants as well. So detecting those are important by understanding signatures. So we'll be able to protect each of your file servers where most of your data resides, because all the users are remote, or many of the users have become remote now. The ability to not just use your backups, but we have an environment that's called a excuse me, a fail-safe backup. And that means that every single file that has been changed at any point in time by the user will be saved. The latest version, I mean like moments ago. So when you recover, this is where you save an enormous amount of time, where you can restore and minimize your disruption and recover those files in mere minutes. And then obviously one of the things that is super important is the user that was the culprit in creating the ransomware distribution will be blocked and an alert will be set so that the administrator can really start and employ the different methodologies of cleaning up the computer and making sure that all the files are back in order. So what does that mean and how does that actually work? So there's a couple of ways. So we talked about, I mentioned earlier, the file screening. The file screening is really understanding what a variant is, and we keep daily updates about each variant so we can block and prevent any infiltration of that particular file screening. But when we don't know, we use deception method, which is using honeypots. And the technology there is literally creating files across a multitude of drives so that we know when that particular file's being touched, then that we also know that a ransomware is being found. So the fail-safe approach, storing the data, restoring the data, locking down the user. Those are really the 4 steps that are going to be very important. The fact that it's low cost, fast in terms of installation. This presentation is probably about 45 minutes to an hour. You will have installed this and you potentially could have stopped a ransomware from processing through your system. So your ROI is super fast on that. So really that was a really brief, but we'd be more than happy to give you a demonstration on that. So for the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a real quick overview, a fast overview of cerebral. And the cerebral environment, we talked about proactive, we talked about understanding what's going on. A user who has an employer that's doing onboarding, it's important to onboard your employees, but Christine talked about offboarding too. So it's one thing to make sure that all your employees get everything that they need. It's also important to know what's going on when you offboard them, when they leave the company or when they're fired. So there's really 3 areas of security or 3 areas of importance that I'm going to address. Insider threat, insider risk security, the concept of insider threat risk, right? So we're going to measure the risk of the threat based on certain points and variables that we're collecting. We have, of course, the ability to look at all the activities that are being done to measure their engagement and productivity, where they're engaged in compliance, where your company has compliance in place and want to be able to measure either it's government driven, whether it's HIPAA or SOC, or your own policies within your organization. So what's cerebral and what does the platform include? So it's one integrated single platform. The platform addresses 3 areas. So we talked about earlier about behavior analytics. What is it? What is behavior analytics? It's really understanding behavior changes from a baseline. So once we have the ability to collect enough data to establish a baseline, that baseline becomes the area that we compare changes from. So with that behavior analytics, we can do more proactive activities and look at preemptive and predictive type activities that may put your organization in a higher risk state. The next piece is the user activity monitoring. So we talked about data exfiltration, file transfers, communication, emails. All those components are pieces that we're going to collect, and combined with the behavior analytics, we're going to give you a predictive risk score. And the predictive risk score is going to address areas such as espionage and finance and so forth. And I'll mention that a little bit later in the next few minutes. So our whole platform gives you the components that you need to really be ahead before a loss within your organization takes place. Predictive analytics. So, one of the things that's really always difficult is to establish machine language based on activities. So building data, building what we call synthetic data, so data that creates a flow of potential activities from users. So we have the ability to build and to use the data that was provided against the CERT Insider Threat Center data set that we used, that really takes us into establishing if the user falls under the accidental leak category, the opportunistic data theft, the espionage, the financial fraud, or the sabotage. And Christine mentioned pretty much all of those things in her examples. And so that's one of the things that we're really good at against the data that we're collecting and the data set that we tested against. Compliance today has become and is becoming more of a nightmare, and that's really because of the ability for users to now work from home. We expect that 50% of the staff out there today will continue to work from home. So when the breach between the organization is lost, there's an immediate violation to a compliance. You can no longer track the data. You can no longer track where the document is. So what we do, it's okay for us in terms of collecting the information. We continue to collect the information where the user is, where the file is being moved, and when the file is being deleted, we can actually track that back and send the data back to the server where the data continues to be collected, even if there is no communication directly through a VPN, for example. We talked about documents. Documents are in multitude of places today. They're in homes, they're in Starbucks, coffee shops, they're everywhere. So understanding where those documents are is important, who has it, where they are when they have it, and what they do with it. How the environment actually works is for each type of device. So we're talking about Mac OS, Microsoft devices running the Microsoft operating system, even the phones, even the Android phones. And more recently, we've added the Chrome tablets as well. That would fall very well into organizations that are moving to Chrome, or of course in the education space as well. All the data that's collected locally, we have agents on each one of those devices. Those devices are going to send the data to the server that's collecting the information. It's at that point that that data is analyzed and established to build either the baseline or to establish alerts based on certain conditions that you'll have decided is more important to be alerted on. So everything is controlled by what your security, what your parameters to an insider threat program would be, or even just to know exactly where the files are and where they came from, where they're going. That's a lot of information that we're going to collect. All this information that you see here, these are just data points that I just wanted to highlight. And I mentioned earlier that a combination of user behavior analytics and user activity monitoring pointed into the AI with 25 different variables is what is calculated in order to give you a risk score by individuals. All the data that we're collecting, whether it's files transferred, documents moving, all the applications that are being used, the user status, of course, if those documents are being printed or exported into a USB or any kind of removable media, these are just examples. Email content, again, Christine mentioned about copying. One of the examples she gave was copying documents to their emails. But today, people might use the BCC feature. We're also going to track the BCC feature. So we can actually tell you when somebody does a BCC action on a file or on a copy of their email. The chat conversations, there's been some significant conversations about breaches between two individuals, whether they're in the company or outside the company, communicating with another person outside the company. So again, we talked about trying to convince internal people to bring out IP information. websites, keystrokes, and then, of course, all of this we have the ability to also, which is something that is important, is the proof behind watching, analyzing, and recording is our screenshots. So we have the ability to store a screenshot based on all the events that have occurred and that you can play back just like a DVR to see the data. So these are all data points that are being captured. Really quickly, I've got 3 slides before I hand it over to Christine. But this is the dashboard where you can actually see every agent that's being deployed, every agent's versions that are being recorded, when they last checked in. Of course, this dashboard gives you the ability to see not just the recorders being deployed, but of course you can take it down even further and look at the endpoint agents when it comes to monitoring on charts. So all the people that you have are grouped by organization. And so again, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, look at all your finance people, look at your particular investigation. You can run your own investigation and group those people in any one of these views, or even take it to any one of these charts and or reports. So everything is configurable, everything is capable of looking at all the data. And finally, the integration with Active Directory, the ability to pump all the data and then send it to a SIM environment. Very large organizations have SIM environments that they want to use in order to be able to see and compare not just the data of their users, but the data of their security access, their data to their drive access. So there's a lot of information here when it comes to really tracking everything. When you come to the risk score, all those 25 points, they literally will give you a score, and that score will be based on what is important to you in terms of making a score more significant than another. So there's measurements that you can change. And then finally, access to the data is super important because a lot of information that's being covered, a lot of information that's being saved. So it's important to have a role-based access to the data. That's something to look for. A feature-based access to the data, because there's a lot of pieces of data that you want to make sure only is available or seen by certain logins or certain users. So you can go all the way down to seeing or changing event alerts, seeing or viewing the different users from different groups. And then finally on the event basis, okay, now that you have all these users, which pieces of data do you need to see? The keystrokes, the file transfers. So you can limit those as well. So it's important to have a very robust management access to the highly sensitive information that we would be collecting. And then of course, finally, what is all this bringing you? So we're going to watch all the information for you. We're going to analyze all the information for you, and we're going to alert you. After that, the seeing and the reacting is really all about your program. It's all about your insider risk program and what you want to do when you do see the data, when you do investigate a user or within an organization or groups of users, in fact, and then how you're going to react to it. The reacting part is really part of your insider threat program. And then, of course, seeing all the data in one place, everything is available through dashboards, reports, and alerts, and it's all through a DVR-like with the screenshots in order to see exactly what happened. I think I have made it to 12 o'clock. I'm going to hand it over to you, Christine, to close it off.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And that is all such helpful information to actually see how it works in practice. So thank you so much for sharing your valuable perspective and for getting us a look into this. We're going to wrap up here. I know we're at the end of the hour. So thanks everyone for tuning in and spending the last hour with us. If you have questions, of course, reach out to the team at sales@veriato.com. And until then, stay safe and secure out there, everyone.
Thank you very much.